My own children decided I was too old to manage my own life, so they trapped me in my own home and tried to steal my life savings. They smiled to my face, telling me how much they cared, all while forging my signature on papers that would leave me with nothing. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. And I made sure our entire family had a front row seat when I turned our Thanksgiving dinner into the courtroom where I served them their just desserts. The week before Thanksgiving, the world still felt like my own. I was on a video call with my granddaughter Emily, her face bright on my tablet screen as she showed me the new sweater she'd bought for the holiday. It was a lovely shade of crimson, and seeing her so excited was like a ray of sunshine. We were laughing about how her grandfather, my late David, would have called her his little robin redbreast. In those moments, everything felt right. Then my daughter Karen walked into my living room, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. She had that smile on her face, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She leaned over my shoulder, heaping praise on me for being so good with the tablet, telling me how sharp my mind still was. It was the kind of compliment that feels more like an assessment. She then pointed to a small box on my side table, a new set of watercolor paints I'd ordered online. She questioned the purchase with a little laugh, wondering aloud if it was a wise expense. It was a small thing, a tiny comment, but it felt like the first bar being gently placed on a cage I didn't yet know was being built around me. Over the next few days, the construction of that cage went into high gear. My son Michael came over with his toolbox and a bright, artificial cheerfulness. He installed a new internet security system he said to protect me from the scams that target seniors. The result was that my internet access was suddenly throttled and filled with parental controls as if I were a teenager. Suddenly, websites I'd visited for years were blocked for being unsafe. When I tried to argue, Karen just patted my hand and told me it was for my own good. They were just looking out for me, she insisted. The care campaign intensified. My phone calls started getting screened. If an old friend called, Karen would answer and politely explain I was resting, promising I'd call back, a promise she never relayed to me. My mail began to be sorted before I saw it, with bills and bank statements mysteriously disappearing into a folder Karen kept for safekeeping. They framed it all as an act of profound love, a way to lighten my load and protect me from a world that had grown too complicated and dangerous for a woman my age. I felt like a porcelain doll being placed on a high shelf, admired but never touched, and certainly never allowed to move on my own. On Wednesday, Michael arrived with a leather-bound folder and a sense of manufactured urgency. He explained it was just a routine update for my estate plan, some papers David's lawyer had recommended to simplify things for everyone down the line. He was so charming, so patient, flipping through the pages and pointing where I needed to sign. He talked about having to get to Emily's soccer game soon, a subtle pressure that made me feel like I'd be a burden if I took too long to read everything. So I trusted him. I trusted my son. I signed where he pointed, my familiar signature looping across pages I barely scanned. I believed I was just updating my will, a simple act of a mother making things easier for her children. I didn't see the document buried in the middle of the stack, the one granting him power of attorney. That night, the gentle chill of autumn had settled over my garden. I was out back, trimming the last of the roses, finding a bit of peace in the quiet snip of the shears. The kitchen window was cracked open, and through it I heard Karen's voice. It wasn't her usual calm, slightly condescending tone. This was a frantic, sharp whisper, ragged with panic. My hands froze over a rose bush. "The payment is due on the 30th. Michael," she hissed into her phone, "if we don't transfer the rest of Mom's savings by then, the bank will start proceedings. You told me the papers would give us full access. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I don't know how long I stood there in the garden, the cold metal of the shears in my hand. The world had tilted on its axis. The love, the care, the concern, it was all a stage play, and I was the unwitting audience. I finally went inside, moving like an old woman, which was something I'd never felt before. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and let the shock wash over me, but underneath it, something hard and cold began to form. It was resolve. They thought I was a fragile old thing to be managed. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table while Karen poured me a cup of coffee. Her smile was back in place, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the dark circles she'd tried to hide with makeup. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands, and then I made my first move. I looked up at her, feigning the kind of mild confusion she'd come to expect from me. I told her I was thinking of getting a new laptop, and that Emily had mentioned something about a shared family cloud account for photos. I asked if she could show me how to access it. It was such a simple, innocent question. But for Karen, it was a grenade. The reaction was immediate. Panic flared in her eyes before she could mask it. She fumbled with the sugar bowl, her hand trembling slightly. She told me the cloud was far too complicated, that it was a messy system Michael had set up, and that it would only confuse me. Her voice was a little too high, a little too fast. Her excuses were flimsy, and we both knew it. Later that day, I heard them arguing in the hallway, their voices hushed but frantic. Karen was insisting the laptop was clean, that there was nothing for me to find. Michael was terrified Emily might have seen something that his own daughter could be a witness to their fraud. Listening to them, their stories a tangled mess of lies and fear, was all the confirmation I needed. They were guilty and they were amateurs. That afternoon, while Karen was busy organizing my finances in the other room, I made a call. I dialed the number of my late husband's oldest friend, George, a retired financial planner who was as sharp as a tack and fiercely loyal. I couldn't risk speaking plainly, not with my daughter just down the hall. So I used a code David and I had established with him years ago for emergencies. I told George I was thinking of making a donation to a local charity and wanted his advice. Then I casually mentioned that I seemed to have a leaky faucet in my financial house, and it was becoming a real nuisance. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then George's voice, low and serious, came back. He told me he understood completely, and that he'd start looking into the plumbing for me right away. In that moment, I wasn't alone anymore. I had my first ally. My little probe had rattled them more than I expected. Sensing they were losing their grip, Karen and Michael became more oppressive. My feigned frailty was now treated as a serious medical condition. They insisted on doing all my shopping, bringing me pre-packaged meals they claimed were healthier for me. They took my car keys, saying it wasn't safe for me to drive anymore. Every appointment, every outing was now chaperoned. The atmosphere in the house, which had once been filled with a suffocating false sweetness, was now thick with thinly veiled imprisonment. Their care had become a constant, watchful presence. I realized then that this wasn't just about greed. It was about desperation. They were cornered, and that made them far more dangerous than I could have imagined. When you're cornered, you have two choices. You can rattle the bars of the cage, or you can pretend to be asleep. I chose to sleep. The day after they took my car keys, I began my performance. I started complaining of a deep fatigue, of a fogginess in my head. I would forget things in the middle of a sentence and stare blankly at the television. I let my shoulders slump and my steps shuffle. It was a calculated retreat, and it worked perfectly. My children, who so desperately needed to believe they were in control, saw what they wanted to see: a frail, dependent mother whose brief spark of defiance had been extinguished. Their vigilance softened into a condescending sort of pity. The constant watchfulness was replaced by a self-satisfied confidence. They thought the panic was over, that they had finally won. Their relief made them careless, and in their carelessness, I found my answers. One afternoon, while taking out the trash, I found a crumpled, tear-stained envelope at the bottom of the kitchen bin. It was a foreclosure notice for Michael's house. Seeing it, the pieces of his desperation clicked into place. I remembered 2008, how the crash had shattered his confidence. He'd lost a high-paying job and had been chasing that sense of security ever since, drowning in the shame of not being able to provide for his family the way he thought a man should. I could almost hear the justification running through his mind. This wasn't theft from his mother. It was a loan he was owed, a correction for a lifetime of financial anxiety that fate had unfairly dealt him. I understood his pain, I truly did. But it didn't give him the right to destroy my life to fix his own. My naps became my headquarters. With the door to my bedroom closed, they assumed I was sleeping off my latest bout of confusion. In reality, I was in my closet speaking in whispers on a small prepaid burner phone I'd kept hidden for years. My conversations with George were brief and to the point. He confirmed my worst fears. Large sums of money had been transferred out of my savings account, starting the day after Michael had me sign those papers. The next step was gathering proof. I knew my own computer was compromised, so I created a reason to leave the house. I insisted on attending my weekly book club meeting at the public library. It was a routine so ingrained in my life that even Karen couldn't argue against it without revealing her hand. She drove me there, telling me she'd be back in an hour. Inside, I didn't go to the meeting room. I went straight to the public computers, a small USB drive hidden in my palm. With George on my burner phone talking me through the steps, I logged into my online banking. My hands shook as I saw the transactions one after another draining the accounts David and I had worked our whole lives to build. I saved every statement, every transfer record, every digital footprint of their betrayal onto that drive. I suppose when you get away with something you believe you're entitled to, it makes you feel invincible. High on his perceived success, Michael made a mistake, so arrogant, so blindingly stupid, it was almost a gift. A few days later, my granddaughter Emily was showing me photos on her phone. She swiped to a picture of her father beaming, standing in front of a brand new luxury car, the kind he couldn't possibly afford. He had posted it for the whole world to see, bragging about his new purchase. My heart ached for Emily, who was so proud of her father's success. But for me, the photograph was more than just a picture. It was evidence. It was a public and dated record of his spending, a loud, flashy contradiction to the story of desperate hardship I knew he would eventually try to tell. He had just handed me the rope. Thanksgiving morning arrived, and the air in my house was thick enough to carve with a knife. The scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon couldn't mask the underlying odor of desperation. Karen and Michael were playing their parts, setting the table with practiced smiles and hollow laughter. But their eyes were constantly darting towards me, checking my every move. They still believed I was their frail, confused mother, a problem they had successfully managed. Emily was the only genuine light in the room, her youthful excitement a stark contrast to her parents' tension. I sat in my armchair watching them, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the evidence-filled USB drive feeling like a heavy, solid weight in my pocket. I was a spider in the center of a web, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull. That moment came just as Karen picked up the carving knife to address the turkey. The doorbell rang, a clear, sharp chime that cut through the strained holiday chatter. Karen froze, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Michael went to the door. Standing on the doorstep was George, looking impeccable in a dark suit, holding a leather briefcase. He looked like the physical embodiment of consequences. Michael's jaw went slack. George stepped inside his presence, commanding the room, and introduced himself in a calm, authoritative voice as my financial advisor. He then announced that he was here for our scheduled portfolio review. The color drained from my children's faces. George didn't wait for an invitation. He walked to the dining room table, cleared a space among the festive dishes, and opened his briefcase. He laid out a single piece of paper, a bank statement, with a series of large withdrawals highlighted in yellow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was absolute. And in that silence, Michael completely fell apart. It wasn't a dignified crumble. It was a messy, ugly collapse. He started sobbing, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, self-pitying rush. He confessed everything. The shame of his post-2008 career failure, the terror of the foreclosure notice, the crushing weight of trying to maintain a life he couldn't afford. He talked about how they'd justified it all, convincing themselves they were just borrowing from the family pot to protect everyone's standing, to keep up the facade. He laid their entire hidden history bare on my Thanksgiving table, a pathetic, desperate story of fear and entitlement. The confession shattered the fragile peace. Karen, who had stood frozen until now, erupted in a blaze of fury. But her anger wasn't directed at the situation. It was aimed squarely at her brother. She screamed at him, calling him weak for confessing, for ruining everything. She insisted it was all his bad idea, his inability to manage his life, that had forced her hand. The conspiracy that had bound them together snapped in an instant. They turned on each other like wolves, their alliance dissolving into a venomous tirade of blame and accusation, right there in front of the cooling turkey and their bewildered daughter. I had been silent through it all, letting the poison drain out. Now I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through their frantic shouting like a surgeon's scalpel. I told them this was not a discussion. It was a confession. I let them know I was aware of everything, the exact amount stolen, the lies. And I added, looking directly at Michael, the new car. The shock of that final detail silenced him completely. The power in the room shifted, settling onto my shoulders, not like a burden, but like a familiar cloak. I was no longer their victim, their project, their problem to be managed. I was the judge. I turned my gaze from their terrified faces to my granddaughter, who was watching with wide, heartbroken eyes. And I said to her in a calm, steady voice she could not mistake, "Emily, I need you to listen very carefully to what happens next." The trial was about to begin. With the battle lines drawn, I gestured for George to take a seat at the head of the table, a place my husband David always occupied. It was a symbolic gesture, and everyone felt it. He placed his phone in the center of the table among the serving spoons and gravy boats, and with a tap of his finger, a calm, professional voice filled the room. It was his firm's legal counsel, now acting as an official remote witness to the proceedings. The Thanksgiving feast had officially become a formal hearing. The cozy warmth of the holiday was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical spotlight. There was nowhere for my children to hide. They were trapped at the scene of their greatest betrayal, in the heart of a tradition they had sought to corrupt. I remained seated, my voice even, and began to present my case. I didn't shout or cry. The facts were far more powerful than any display of emotion. I started with the smaller deceptions, the doctored bank statements Karen had so proudly presented to me weeks ago, showing healthy balances that were, in fact, complete fabrications. I then moved to the power of attorney document, which George had already confirmed was being contested on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. Then I took out the small, cheap burner phone I had kept hidden in my knitting bag. I pressed a button, and the room filled with the sound of Michael's voice from a recorded voicemail, a frantic message he'd left his wife admitting he'd moved Mom's money to handle their financial hardship. Karen's face went ashen, but the final piece of evidence didn't come from me. As I set the phone down, Emily, who had been sitting in stunned silence, pushed her chair back and stood up. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice when she spoke was clear and steady. She admitted that she'd seen the bank transfers a few weeks ago on the shared family laptop. She hadn't understood it at first, but she'd seen my name and the large sums of money disappearing. She looked directly at her parents, her expression a devastating mix of love and profound disappointment, and whispered that she knew it was wrong. That was the moment the real judgment was passed. It wasn't a legal verdict from a lawyer on the phone or a financial consequence from George. It was the simple, heartbroken question from their own daughter. She looked from her mother to her father, her chin trembling, and asked, "How could you do that to Grandma?" That question, filled with the pure, wounded morality of a child, was more damning than any prison sentence. It was a moral verdict from which there was no appeal. To see the condemnation in their daughter's eyes, to know that they had not only betrayed me, but had also shattered her image of them, that was their true and lasting punishment. With the truth laid bare, I delivered the consequences. I spoke calmly, laying out a path that was just not cruel. I informed them that a fraud report had already been filed with my bank's Elder Abuse Division. The wheels of official consequence were already turning. However, I was offering them one chance to mitigate the damage and avoid criminal charges. The terms were not negotiable. First, they would write and sign a full confession detailing every action they took to be notarized by George's firm. Second, they would agree to a legally binding restitution plan, also to be drafted by George, to repay every single cent. And third, they would offer an immediate, heartfelt, and public apology. Not to me, my forgiveness was not on the table. They would apologize to Emily for trying to corrupt her, for lying to her, and for forcing her to bear witness to their profound failure of character. The choice I gave them wasn't really a choice at all. It was a door. One door led to accountability, the other to ruin. After a long, suffocating silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, they nodded. There were no grand apologies, no sudden floods of remorse. There was only the quiet, hollowed-out shame of two people who had been so thoroughly beaten. George and his legal counsel handled the details. The apology to Emily was awkward, and stilted words forced from a place of fear rather than genuine regret. But it was a start. That Thanksgiving ended not with a feast, but with the signing of documents that legally bound them to their consequences. The aftermath was swift and quiet. The first thing to go was Michael's flashy new car, sold at a loss just to make the first restitution payment. A week later, a for sale sign appeared on their lawn. They had to downsize, moving from their carefully curated suburban home to a small, cramped rental apartment. The social fallout was just as brutal. News like this has a way of spreading through a family, whispered over phone calls and text messages. Invitations to Christmas parties dried up. Cousins who once called weekly fell silent. They had built their lives on a facade of success, and when that facade crumbled, they found there was nothing left underneath. They were isolated, left alone in the wreckage they had created. From what I heard mostly through George, they walked two very different paths through that wreckage. Michael, truly humbled by the experience, began the slow, painful work of rebuilding himself. He started going to therapy, finally confronting the financial trauma and shame that had haunted him for over a decade. He took on a second job, working late nights to meet the restitution payments, not just as an obligation, but as a form of penance. Karen, however, retreated deeper into bitterness. In her version of the story, she was the true victim, a victim of her husband's weakness, her mother's cruelty, and a world that had never given her a fair chance. She refused to see her own role in their downfall, choosing the cold comfort of denial over the difficult work of accountability. I, on the other hand, was finally free. The old house, with its memories of both laughter and betrayal, felt more like a museum than a home. I sold it and moved into a vibrant retirement community, a place filled with art classes, bustling social events, and people who knew me only as Eleanor, not as a widow or a victim. With the money George recovered, I established a scholarship in my late husband's name for underprivileged students. The funds my children had tried to steal for their own selfish needs would now build futures for deserving young people. It was a beautiful kind of justice. My bond with Emily became the cornerstone of my new life. We talked every day, our relationship no longer filtered through her parents' lies. It was a connection forged in truth, stronger and more precious than ever. Months later, I was hosting a small dinner in my new sunlit apartment. The table was set for 4, but there were only 3 of us, me, George, and Emily. The room was filled with easy laughter as Emily told us about her plans for college. The air was light, warm, and peaceful. At the table beside Emily sat an empty chair, and beside George there was another. They weren't there for ghosts or for guests who had yet to arrive. They were silent monuments to a permanent new reality, a quiet testament to the choices that had been made. Looking at the 2 most important people in my life, I felt a profound sense of peace. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed into wisdom. I had learned that true family isn't about blood. It's about the love you earn and the respect you give. And in that little apartment surrounded by that love, I was finally home. In the end, it wasn't just about winning. It was about understanding. The matriarch saw that her children weren't monsters, but people broken by fear and shame. Their pain was real, but she understood that pain is an explanation, not an excuse. It doesn't give anyone a license to betray, steal, or harm those who love them. True strength, she realized, is drawing a firm line between compassion for someone's struggle and accountability for their actions. Justice served with clarity instead of rage is the kind that truly lasts.